This is the story of a teenage sultan who changed history. Get ready to meet the conqueror of Constantinople. At just 21, Sultan Muhammad Al-Fateh took on the mighty city of Constantinople, a challenge many thought was impossible. With vision, courage, and strategy, he led his people to victory, forever changing the course of history. His legacy? A true symbol of determination and greatness. Sultan Muhammad Fateh, the great Ottoman caliph whose miraculous conquest of Constantinople, Istanbul, made history in world naval warfare. Introduction. Sultan's name was Muhammad Sani, but in history he is remembered as Sultan Muhammad Fateh. His lineage is as follows: Sultan Muhammad, Sani bin Sultan Murad II, bin Sultan Muhammad I, bin Sultan Bayezid Yıldırım bin Murad I, bin Sultan Erkan Gazi bin Osman Khan, founder of the Ottoman dynasty. Muhammad Fateh was the seventh sovereign of the Ottoman Empire. Birth: Sultan Muhammad Sani was born on the 20th of April, 1424. 26 Rajab, 831 AH. Childhood, education, and upbringing. Muhammad's father, Sultan Murad, was a just, determined, kind, and generous Muslim ruler who strictly adhered to the Sharia. His people were happy with him as his reign was one of peace and prosperity. Sultan Murad was renowned for his welfare work. From the beginning, Sultan Murad made sure that his son received the best education and upbringing. He paid handsome salaries to the best teachers and scholars of the time to teach his son all the prevalent sciences. Muhammad Sani was not only intelligent, he also had a great zeal for learning. His teachers acknowledged his intelligence and extraordinary abilities. At a young age, he became proficient in Arabic, Persian, Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, apart from his native language, Turkish. Besides religion, he had a special interest in Greek philosophy, history, and Eastern culture and civilization. He used to read with great interest about kings, especially conquerors like Alexander the Great, and was an ardent admirer of his heroic adventures. He had a natural inclination towards poetry, and while still a young prince, had become a great connoisseur of poetry under the guidance of his teachers. He had memorized the best poetry written by Turkish, Arab, and Persian poets. Muhammad was quick to excel in the art of writing and speaking. Apart from this, he would also take interest in learning the skills of warfare. The Ottoman sovereigns were not inclined towards a life of luxury. In fact, apart from being rulers of the state, they were also army generals. Muhammad had inherited his courage and valor from his ancestors. His own father, Sultan Murad, was a brave warrior. Muhammad learnt from his father the tactics of warfare planning and strategy as well as how to manage the government and the politics. During his reign, Sultan Murad was constantly at war with his enemies. The reason behind this was not his greed to expand his territory, but his enemies forced him every time to wage war against them. As soon as his enemy would concede defeat, he would put down his weapons and would strictly abide by all peace treaties. Tired after 22 years of conflict, he entered into a peace agreement for 10 years with the King of Hungary. On the way back, he received the news of the death of Aladdin, his oldest and extremely capable son. This news shook him up so much that he decided to permanently separate himself from the affairs of the state. Sultan made his other son Muhammad the king, who was at the time only 14 years old, and left for Asia Minor where he devoted himself to the remembrance of Allah. As soon as the news spread that the Sultan's young and inexperienced son had ascended the throne, the Christians launched an attack disregarding the peace treaty. As a result of this, there was great bloodshed in the coastal areas of the Black Sea. When Sultan Murad was given this news, he was moved to tears. He put his prayer mat on his horse, gathered an army of 40,000 men and proceeded to Varna, where he inflicted a crushing defeat upon the Crusaders. Once again, Murad handed over the throne to his son and went back to Magnesia. A few years later, he had to again come back to power to curb rebellion in the army. For the next 6 years he ruled with great pomp and splendor. Around this time, Muhammad got married to the daughter of a convert. For the next 6 years, in his capacity as heir to the throne, he gained experience by working in different departments of the state. And finally, after being crowned twice before, he returned to the throne permanently at the age of 21 years. Ascension to the throne. Sultan Murad Sani passed away on the 3rd of February 1453, 856 AH. On hearing the news of his death, Muhammad Sani, without any hue and cry, arrived in Gallipoli from Magnesia where he was residing at that time. For fear of rebellion, he kept the news of his father's death a secret. During his father's life, whenever he took control of the affairs of the government, Prime Minister Khalil Pasha and his allies always complained of his attitude. They thought that he did not take into consideration anyone's suggestion in front of his own opinion. Even though their criticism gave him a chance to rectify his mistakes, he knew that if he did not handle things wisely, his succession could be in danger. He waited for a suitable time to announce his father's death, and immediately thereafter, his coronation ceremony took place. At the age of 21, he had already gained practical experience to bear this heavy responsibility. Showing great prudence and insight, he did not remove any of the senior officials from their existing positions. He also appointed new people on the basis of their ability and aptitude. In the last 6 years, not only had Sultan Muhammad learnt how to govern the state, but had also become an experienced general. However, the king of Constantine still considered him to be inexperienced. He started to create trouble at the borders. He sent an envoy to Sultan's court who delivered this message in a rude manner. If the Sultan does not increase the stipend of this Ottoman prince who was in his custody, we will ourselves put him on the throne of the Ottoman Empire. When Sultan got this message in Asia Minor, he was busy punishing a few rebellious members of the elite ruling class. Patiently, he heard this threatening message and ignored it for the time being. Everyone knew that war was now imminent. Ottoman Turks and Constantinople. Before we give an account of Sultan Muhammad Fateh's greatest achievement, it is necessary to understand the conditions prevailing at that time. In the 11th century, Muslims gained real strength in Asia Minor as a result of the Seljuk conquests. However, passing time saw the decline of the Seljuk Empire, and mutual disputes deprived it of its original glory. In the midst of the 13th century, a few Turk families from the Oghuzes tribe fled from Khorasan fearing attacks by Genghis Khan. Unable to find shelter for some time, they finally started their journey towards Asia Minor to seek refuge with Seljuk Emperor Alauddin. When they reached Angora, they saw a huge cloud of dust that had covered the horizon. When Artugrul, their tribal leader, climbed the top of a mountain, he saw 2 armies engaged in heavy fighting. One army was much less in number than the other, and it seemed that soon it would flee after being overcome by the bigger army. Since it was usual among the Turks to help the weaker party, Artugrul and his men joined the smaller army and helped them win the battle. After the battle ended, Artugrul realized that his timely assistance had actually helped Alauddin Seljuk avert defeat at the hands of the Tartars. The attacks by the Tartars had caused destruction in the entire Islamic world, and now they were at war with Sultan Seljuk in Asia Minor. To show his gratitude, Sultan Alauddin Seljuk gave Artugrul a flourishing and fertile piece of land, next to the borders of the Greek Empire. After some time, Artugrul, serving as the deputy of the Sultan, defeated the Greeks and the Mongols. Pleased, the Sultan rewarded him with more land and named his state Sultanuni. Artugrul was also nominated as the commander of a section of the Sultan's army. He would choose the finest and the bravest young men from his state for his army. After seeing their strength and courage on the Greek borders, the Christians were terrified of this small but courageous army. After Artugrul passed away, the Sultan handed over his territory to his competent son, Osman, who would later become the founder and the first sovereign of the Ottoman Empire. Osman always stayed loyal to the Seljuk rulers even though their government became weak with time, and there was much dissension among the deputies. Establishment of the Ottoman Empire. After the death of the last Seljuk emperor, many chieftains founded small states of their own. Osman also declared his independence and thus laid the foundation of a vast empire which would be included amongst the great powers of the world within 150 years. In less than 300 years, the Ottoman Empire became the greatest empire of the world in its strength and expanse. This empire lasted for around 625 years and came to an end when in 1924, Gazi Mustafa Kemal Pasha Ataturk announced the creation of a democratic state in Turkey. After the end of the Seljuk Empire, 10 small states had been created, Within a short span of time, Osman had absorbed all the neighboring areas into his empire. The span of his conquests had brought him so close to Constantinople that Kaiser had to request the Tartars for help. Osman's son, Ur Khan, exhausted the Tartars by inflicting a series of defeats upon them. Sultan Osman was on his deathbed when Barossa, a key city, was conquered. The advice that he gave his son Ur Khan before dying gives us an insight into his character, approach, and strategy. He said, "Do not be cruel or tyrannical. Be fair and just to people so that they are happy and the country prospers. Expand your state through victories so that Allah's message spreads in every direction. Always keep the scholarly and learned men close to yourself and listen to their advice. Make the adherence to Sharia and its implementation your focus. Always strive to inculcate good character in your people and give it preference over all matters. In this way, mankind will develop and prosper. The only aim of my life was to spread Islam and to put ethics into practice. You should also make this the purpose of your life." After Osman Khan's death, his son Ur Khan took control of the state and focused his attention on expanding the empire. In Europe, he clashed with the Greeks, but he managed to defeat them. He also gained control of Adrianople, and later it was made the capital. The Ottoman emperors that succeeded him managed to even conquer Serbia, Bulgaria, and Albania. The Christians of Europe formed an alliance against the Fourth Ottoman Caliph Bayezid I. In 1396, the Christian allies suffered a crushing defeat in the Battle of Nicopolis at the hands of the Ottoman army. Now, Sultan Bayezid became even more confident and started a siege of Constantinople. This worried the Europeans immensely, and they decided to call Timur from Asia to confront Bayezid. Timur, who was himself a great conqueror, agreed to fight against another Muslim ruler only to prove his supremacy over him. Bayezid was forced to lift the siege, and subsequently the most deplorable battle in the history of Islam took place at Angora. Bayezid's army of 120,000 was up against Timur's force of 500,000. Bayezid was defeated and captured in this battle. According to some reports, Timur kept him in a cage where he died after 8 months. The Battle of Angora apparently caused the decline of the Ottoman Empire. It started losing territories one after the other and was soon dispersed like scattered beads. The Greeks gained courage by this and started interfering at the borders. When Timur left to invade China, Bayezid's sons started fighting for the throne, and eventually Sultan Muhammad I emerged victorious. Not only did he re-establish the Ottoman Empire, but also organized his armies to fight against the Europeans. After Sultan Muhammad I died, his son Sultan Murad Sani ascended the throne. Sultan Muhammad Fateh was his son. During Sultan Murad Sani's reign, the Ottomans had absolute control over the Balkans. They also conquered Venice, Greece, Hungary, and Albania. After the historical victories at Kosovo and Varna, Sultan Muhammad Fateh's father had control in Europe extending to River Danube except for Constantinople. He left the world with the wish to conquer Constantinople in his heart. Initial efforts to conquer Constantinople. Before we give an account of how Constantinople was conquered, it is necessary to mention the importance of this city and the previous efforts that had been made by the Muslims to conquer it. Since the time of Hazrat Amir Muawiyah, the Muslims wanted to capture this city, as the Prophet Isa had predicted the conquest of the city at the hands of Muslims. The Prophet had also given glad tidings of forgiveness to the first army that attacked Constantinople. He said, "The first army amongst my followers who will invade Caesar's city will be forgiven their sins." Sahih Bukhari. Allah had also given the Prophet knowledge of the fact that the first army would not succeed. In another hadith, he gave glad tidings of victory and said, "Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. This victorious army would be good, and so would be its leader." Al-Musnad Ahmad, Hakim, Ibn Shayba. This is the reason why the Muslims wanted to conquer this city since the time of the righteous caliphs. In 48 AH, Amir Muawiyah sent the first Muslim army through land and sea routes to Constantinople. Several prominent companions of the Prophet Isa, namely Hazrat Abu Ayyub Ansari, Ubadah bin Samit, Abu Darda, Abdullah bin Umar, Abdullah bin Zubair, and Abdullah bin Abbas, were part of this expedition. However, the wall of the city was very strong and the Muslims were also unable to tolerate the harsh winter. Abu Ayyub Ansari died during the siege and asked to be buried under the city wall inside the enemy territory. A few other Muslims were also martyred, and the city could not be conquered. 2 attempts were made during the rule of Banu Umayyah, while during the rule of Banu Abbas, Caliph Harun Rashid himself led an army of 100,000 to Constantinople. However, the queen made peace with him by agreeing to pay a yearly tax. When the Ottoman Empire was founded in Asia Minor, it faced constant hostility from the European kings. Apart from Constantinople, the whole of the Balkans was conquered by the Ottomans. Bayezid Yıldırım was the first Ottoman emperor that laid siege to Constantinople. Later, Muhammad's father, Sultan Murad, made an attempt to conquer the city, but he also failed and left the world with this unfulfilled wish in his heart: the significance of Constantinople. The importance that this city had from the start for the Ottoman Empire can be understood by a dream that is mentioned in the books of history. Once when Osman, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, was staying at the house of his spiritual leader, Atabali, he saw a dream. Osman saw a crescent rise from the bosom of Atabali, and after becoming a full moon, sank into his own bosom. After that, a great tree sprang from his side and started growing bigger till it spread over land and sea. From the roots of this tree gushed the 4 great rivers of the world: Tigris, the Euphrates, Danube, and Nile. The branches of this great tree were supported by the 4 great mountains of the world: Caucasus, Taurus, Balkan, and Atlas. Then a strong wind blew, and the leaves of the tree, which were sword-shaped, started pointing towards a great city. This city, which was at the junction of 2 seas and 2 continents, seemed like a ring set with 2 sapphires and 2 emeralds. Osman was about to wear this ring when he woke up. Later, he narrated this dream to his mentor Atabali, who gave him the good news that one day he would be the founder of a great empire, that Muslims would benefit from his children, and that he, Atabali, would give his daughter in marriage to him. This dream did come true. The city that Osman saw in his dream was actually Constantinople, Istanbul, on which the people of East and West had their eyes for the last 1,000 years. Its geographical location, moderate climate, safe ports, spacious markets, clean roads, high-rise buildings, magnificent churches, strong forts, and its commercial and cultural importance had made it prominent in the world. Constantinople was instrumental in introducing the Roman law and the Greek philosophy to the world. Its libraries and educational institutions were famous around the world, and its ports were full of well-stocked ships from far and near. Thousands of people from Russia, Hungary, Germany, Italy, Serbia, Albania, Hispania, and various Asian countries resided in Constantinople, making it an international city. This is why the outside world in every era had its eyes on Constantinople, and the city had to put up with incessant attacks of the enemy. Being in a constant state of war had damaged its economy and military power. The king of Constantinople always had the role of a dictator who, in addition to possessing political authority, also served as the spiritual leader of the people. The 14th century did not prove too good for the Christian leadership of Constantinople. Christian states belonging to the Roman Catholic sect seized many of the territories from the Greeks. Constantine, the king of Constantinople, tried his best to form an alliance of the Christian states in order to get rid of Turkey from Europe, but his efforts proved futile. By the end of his rule, his state was limited to a few miles, and Constantinople was a capital which was a country in itself. In addition, the army, the tribal leaders, government officials, and even the clergy were all conniving by nature. Despite these conditions, Constantine never missed any chance to inflict harm upon the Turks. Breaking treaties with the Muslims seemed to be part of their tradition. Even though he had made peace with Sultan Muhammad's father, Constantine started threatening him soon after his father's death. Sultan Muhammad advances forward. At this point, the first thing that Sultan Muhammad did was to tighten his control over all internal matters of the empire. After that, he decided that the time to conquer Constantinople had come, as it was hanging like a sword over the Ottoman Empire. Besides, the prophet's prediction was also something that he had in his mind. This thought troubled him so much that one night he couldn't sleep at all. Restless, he sent for his minister Khalil Pasha, who was perplexed at being beckoned at such an odd time. On his arrival, the Sultan said, "Can you see what grief and sorrow has done to me? I turned sides the whole night but still can't get any sleep. I just ask for one thing from you, that you give me Constantinople." Khalil Pasha comforted him, knowing that the Sultan was sincere in his desire and that true passion could make the impossible into possible. As a first step, the Sultan reached truce with a few Christian states and also started the construction of a fortress Anatolia Hisar, just 5 miles away from Constantinople. The purpose of building this fortress was to keep an eye on the movements of the Christian navy and also to block all routes of aid and assistance. As the walls of the fortress became higher, Sultan started storing modern weapons and ammunition. Huge cannons were also built to protect the fortress. Sultan started receiving threats from the Christians, and the situation became tense to the point that an army came and attacked the fortress. However, the army deputed at the fortress defeated them, and the Christian forces retreated, leaving behind their dead. When Constantine saw the turn of events, he knew that the Sultan was intent on attacking the city. He therefore approached the Christian states and asked them for help in the name of religion. It is important to make clear that at this point in time the Christian world was divided into two sects that were old adversaries. 1. Catholics who followed the Roman Pope. 2. People of Constantinople who were influenced by the Greek Church. The Pope did not agree to offer any help. Instead, he insisted on his old demands and said that this matter cannot proceed any further till the Greek Church unites with the Catholic Church. Constantine realized that he had no choice but to agree to this demand. Thus, in the presence of 300 priests, Saint Hagia Sophia and the Roman Church became an alliance. As a result of this agreement, a vast majority of the people of Constantinople grew angry with their king. They were convinced that this alliance would bring upon them the wrath of God. Even Constantine's deputy and the commander-in-chief of his army were so displeased that they thought it would have been better to give up their land to the Turks than agree to the insulting demands of the Pope. After all these efforts that he made to save his land, all that Constantine got from the Christian states was a few hundred soldiers and some gifts of wine. The underlying reason behind this was both the fear of the Turks and religious sectarian prejudice. As part of preparations for war, the Caesar of Constantinople had started storing grains and food provisions. The city of Constantinople was triangular in shape with two of its sides surrounded by water. One side was called the Golden Horn and the other Strait of Marmara Propontis. Thus it could be attacked by land from only one side. 3 great walls, which were wide and fortified with towers, were built to protect the city from attacks. These walls were 60 feet apart, and there was a very wide and hundreds of feet deep trench between them. In the 5th century BC, these walls had been constructed by the then emperor, and they had safeguarded the city during 21 sieges. Thick steel chains had been tied in the sea around the port to stop any ship from entering the port. When the people of the city wanted to allow any ship into the port, they would loosen the chain into the deep sea. Sultan had complete knowledge of all the preparations and the safety measures that were being taken to protect the city. He knew that in order to conquer this city, he would have to successfully bomb these walls. Therefore, instead of depending on ordinary cannons, he asked a Christian engineer to design a much bigger cannon that could shoot 2.5 feet balls. At the same time, he also issued orders to build small and easy-to-move cannons. He was also preparing a fleet of 180 warships to besiege the city by sea. Sultan also feared that Constantine's 2 brothers based in Greece might send him some kind of assistance. He sent soldiers to take control of a strategic area, thereby cutting all sea contact between Greece and Constantinople. The decisive battle. After finishing all the preparations, Sultan Muhammad Al-Fateh finally reached Constantinople on the 16th of April 1453. The morale of the army was very high and everyone was anxious to conquer the city. The army was accompanied by scholars who were keeping the soldiers motivated. Before hoisting the flag on his headquarters, Sultan and his fighters offered prayers and asked Allah for help and victory. Before the commencement of the battle, Sultan had sent a message to Constantine asking him to hand over the city so they could avoid any kind of bloodshed. Constantine rejected this offer. The truth is that Sultan's opponent was also a courageous and brave man. Before the start of the siege, he was advised to leave the city with his family. Enraged at the suggestion, he said that his life and death was for Constantinople and that he would never leave his people in their time of need. His siege started immediately after Constantine refused to hand over the city peacefully. Constantinople was surrounded from both land and sea. Since the wall near the gate of St. Romanus was relatively weak, both the armies were especially focused on this area, Turks in attacking the wall, and the Christians trying to defend it. There was fierce fighting between the Sultan's elite force Yanichari, also called Janissary, and the Christians. Sultan's heavy cannons would damage the city walls, but the Greeks would repair them right away. At one point, Sultan took his army to the edge of the trench and found ways to cross the trench to reach the city wall. The Christians drove them back by lighting oil and throwing it at them. Subsequently, Sultan came up with a new strategy. He built tall wooden towers affixed with wheels, and at the top of these towers long ladders were tied. These towers were then rolled to the edge of the trench, and one end of the ladder was lowered to the other end to make a bridge. When the Ottoman army tried to climb up to reach the city wall, the besieged Christians threw balls of fire and torched the towers. Thus, this strategy also failed. On the 18th of April, there was fierce battle between the Greeks and the Ottoman army. The Greek soldiers defended themselves valiantly, and the Turks were forced to retreat. On the same day, when the Turkish naval fleet moved forward to damage the massive Greek naval ships, it met with heavy bombardment and had to bear great losses. They were also unable to cut through the chains around the harbor. 2 days later, when ships carrying aid arrived from Geneva, the Turks surrounded them in the sea. However, suddenly the wind blew in such a manner that the Italian ships managed to make way between the Ottoman ships and entered Constantinople's harbor. Miracle in the history of naval warfare. Despite repeated failure of his strategies, the Sultan became even more determined and increased his efforts to conquer Constantinople. Now that his navy and army had failed despite their best efforts, he would worry day and night as to what his next course of action should be. After a great deal of contemplation, he came to the conclusion that if they attacked from the direction of the Golden Horn, their chances of success would be high. The reason for this was that on this side of the port, the city wall was not very high and neither was the trench very deep. However, the problem was that there was a strong chain and a fortified Greek naval fleet protecting the entrance of the Golden Horn. Sultan wanted that somehow his ships should enter Golden Horn without clashing with the Greek navy. For this, a strange idea came in his mind. A part of his fleet should be transported by land to Golden Horn. The 10-mile-long strip of land between the Strait of Bosphorus and Golden Horn had an uneven terrain with scattered clusters of small trees. Sultan wanted the ships to be transported through this strip to reach the harbor, see map on the next page. His engineers were perplexed at this suggestion, but he managed to convince them. They leveled the terrain, and then cut trees from the forest and made planks from the trunks. After this, thousands of animals were sacrificed and their fat was used to grease these planks. They were then laid out in a way that ships could be mounted on them and glided into the harbor. The night of the 22nd of April was a hard one for the people of Constantinople. The Ottomans were bombarding them relentlessly with fireballs, so that their attention would be focused on that side. On the other hand, Sultan's men were successful in transporting around 70 to 80 boats and small ships into Golden Horn overnight by gliding them through the planks. When the people of Constantinople woke up in the morning, they were terrified and shocked to see the Turkish fleet in the harbor. There was fear and confusion everywhere. They could not comprehend how such a large number of ships could have come so close without moving the heavy chains and the strong fleet of warships. On hearing this news, Constantine became weary with shock and grief. The unbelievable miracle of naval history had taken place. Nevertheless, he ordered his ships to launch an attack on the Turkish ships. The issue, though, was that the massive Greek ships could not even enter the shallow waters in which the small Turkish ships were anchored. Thus their strength became a weakness for them. The final attack. After 51 days of siege, the Sultan decided to launch the final and decisive attack on Constantinople. Earlier, he had already made an offer to save Constantine and his people. He had sent one of his chiefs, Isfandiyar Ogli, with the message that if the city is handed over to him, he would guarantee the safety of all the people and that Constantine would be given the freedom to go the Turk-occupied peninsula of Morea and to rule over it according to his own will. They were also informed that if they reject this offer, there would be no guarantee for the safety of their lives and property. The camps of the Ottoman army were lit up the whole night on the 27th of May. The soldiers were busy praying and great zeal and fervor could be seen everywhere. On the other hand, the people of Constantinople were dejected after the arrival of the Ottoman ships in the harbor, and news of the imminent attack had also reached them. They remained restless and uneasy that night. Constantine went to the church at St. Sophia with his men and women and asked God for forgiveness. Then he gave a passionate speech. His manner reflected that he was convinced of losing Constantinople. He wandered in the rooms of his magnificent palace where he and his predecessors had ruled for centuries with great pomp and glamour. Lamenting over his past, the last Caesar left to give orders to his army, and Constantinople is conquered. The Turks attacked before daybreak. Fierce fighting ensued on all sides, especially near the door of St. Romanus. The irregular army of the Turks initiated the attack in order to weaken the defense of the enemy, paving the way for the regular army to launch a formidable attack. Sultan was on horseback with an iron mace in his hand. When fierce fighting continued till late afternoon, Sultan sent one of his men to his spiritual leader, who had come with him for spiritual guidance and prayer. Sultan feared that if today Constantinople was not conquered, the Turks would start considering it unconquerable. Hence, he ordered his special force Yanichari to move forward and launch a powerful offensive. Aga Hassan, a strong and able-bodied member of the Yanichari, together with 3 other men moved forward and tried to climb the city wall to hoist the Turkish flag. They were all martyred, one after the other, but they managed to make things easier for the other soldiers who swiftly climbed the city wall and hoisted the Sultan's flag. On the other hand, the naval forces also succeeded in climbing a tower and raising Sultan's flag. The news of the city's capture spread like wildfire amongst the Greeks and consequently their defense fell apart. Constantine and his faithful aides tried their best to unite their men and fight on the front line, but their efforts proved futile. Constantine died fighting valiantly. The next day his body was retrieved from a pile of dead bodies. The only reason he was identified was because his red shoes were quite distinct due to a golden eagle engraved on them. The death of the 45-year-old emperor closed the chapter of the Constantinian Empire forever. It was Zuhr time when Sultan Muhammad Sani, the conqueror of Constantine, accompanied by his generals, ministers, and the army, entered the city with great splendor. They came through the gate of St. Romanus and then marching through marketplaces reached St. Sophia. When he reached the door, he took off his shoes and rubbed dust on his forehead as a show of humility in front of his creator. After that, he entered the church and was awestruck by its beauty. The clergymen were standing at the sacrificial site to welcome him. Sultan kept the chief officer of the church on his duties. In fact, he gave him the additional responsibility to resolve the judicial matters concerning the Christian community. He was also authorized to give recommendations for the rights of the Christians and to give compensation in case any injustice was committed against them. After doing this, he ordered a man to call out the azan, call to prayer. Thus, for the first time instead of church bells, the greatness of Allah's words echoed in the magnificent Hagia Sophia. The church was converted into a mosque, and for hundreds of years it was counted among the most magnificent mosques of the Islamic world. After Ataturk became the head of modern Turkey, he converted the mosque into a museum in 1931 in his zeal to secularize the country and break away from its glorious Islamic past. After leaving the church, Sultan took a walk around the city. He was saddened to see the palaces of great emperors. He read a piece of poetry which meant that even the palaces of great kings like Kisra and Afrasiab are deserted and are now home to cobwebs and owls. The palaces of Caesar were laden with the best works of art, antiques, and treasures from Asia and Europe. which were now in the possession of the Ottoman Turks. Sultan Muhammad was 23 years old when he conquered Constantinople. In this regard, he can be compared to Alexander the Great and Napoleon, who also started their conquests at approximately the same age. After the victory, Sultan sent emissaries to different parts of the Islamic world to announce this blessed news. It sent a wave of happiness throughout the Muslim world. It is reported that right after the conquest there was some bloodshed and looting, but after 3 days, total peace and security were restored. At this point, it is natural to wonder why the Sultan did not use his power to stop the bloodshed and looting by the troops. Like Salahuddin Ayyubi, why he did not protect the lives and properties of the conquered people, which is an important Islamic trait. The basic reason seems to be the fact that Sultan had not been in power for long and did not have absolute control over all matters. Neither did he enjoy such confidence and loyalty that all his decisions would be accepted without any opposition. If in the beginning Constantine had handed over the city without resistance, then according to Sultan's offer, every Christian's life and property would have been protected. In this case, it would have been easy to restrain the troops as they would have captured Constantinople without any sacrifice. Now that they had put everything at stake for this victory, it was very difficult to control them, especially when in recent times their experiences with the Christians had been continuously unpleasant. Also, the Turks had not forgotten the atrocities committed against Muslims in Andalus, Spain. After all this, it was difficult to completely curb their emotions. However, 3 days later, total peace was restored in the city. The Christians soon realized that they were leading a more peaceful and prosperous life now than under their Christian rulers. Sultan Muhammad Al-Fateh's other conquests. The conquest of Constantinople was followed by a series of victories for the Sultan. He was engaged in war during most of his 30-year reign, and there was hardly any expedition after which he would not absorb a new region into his empire. Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Otranto, a city near Italy, Crimea and Carmania were all conquered during his rule. Death Sultan was still busy in his conquests when he was overcome by death. He died in 886 AH at the age of 51 and was buried in the famous mosque that he had constructed in Constantinople. While the Islamic world mourned his death, Europe rejoiced at this news. Sultan's character. Apart from being a monarch, Sultan Muhammad was also a great scholar. He had in-depth knowledge of Quran and Hadith as well as various other sciences. He had immense respect for scholars, and his gatherings would be attended by learned men and experts of various fields. Sultan had keen interest in history and was an avid reader of the lives of great conquerors and emperors. His personal library contained thousands of rare and valuable books. When the city of Aguasa, a center of learning, had to pay tax, the Sultan demanded books in place of wealth and property. He would go himself to attend the lectures of Maulana Alauddin Tusi. He had immense respect for his teacher Al-Qurani and would send a special ride for him. This is the same teacher who beat him with a stick when he was still a prince. In addition to the madrasas that were already present in the towns and cities, Sultan founded many colleges and even appointed the teachers himself. During his rule, he opened thousands of schools that were attached to the mosques. There was not a single village which did not have an educational institute in it, and the education of every child was the responsibility of the state. He founded numerous mosques and hospitals in the cities, and dedicated large properties for their maintenance. Sultan was a talented horseman, an expert in military warfare, and a clever man who loved progress. He also had complete understanding of the affairs of the state. Although he had inherited bravery and valor from his ancestors, the secret of his success was that he would take advantage of new military inventions and was an expert in devising extraordinary military strategies. Sultan had a very modest lifestyle, and his eating habits were also very simple. Whatever time he had left after resolving the affairs of the state, he would spend it in reading or would sometimes go hunting. His life was far from luxurious, and he disliked being lost in gatherings of music and fun. Solitude was very dear to him. He was a reserved man and always kept his distance even with his own prime minister. He would never disclose his secrets to anyone. Whenever he decided to attack, even his commanders were unaware as to which direction the offensive would start from. Once when his forces were being gathered for an expedition, one of his chief officers asked him where they were headed. Sultan sternly replied, "Even if a hair from my beard finds out my plans, I would break it and throw it in the fire." Sultan considered secrecy and swift action as keys to success in a battle, and this was the reason for his stern attitude. This does not mean that Sultan was an arrogant man. Even in the midst of fierce fighting, he would never miss a chance to console the ordinary soldiers of his army. He was always relaxed in his dealings with his non-Muslim subjects. The orders that he issued after conquering Constantinople stated that the Greeks would enjoy full religious freedom, and there was no difference in the treatment meted out to the Turks and the Greeks after the conquest. In those times, religious persecution was at its peak, because the Muslims and the Christians had been at war for a long time. In the prevailing circumstances, sometimes during war, he would deal with his enemies severely instead of giving them concessions. However, we can say that overall he was kind and forgiving for both the Muslim and non-Muslim citizens of his empire. Sultan disliked severity in the implementation of the Sharia. He had great love for the Quran. He regularly attended congregational prayers and never missed his fasts. He was a fair and just man by nature. In his kingdom, the judiciary was totally independent. People could bring their appeals to the king, but he could not influence the decision given by the court. It was difficult for the European historians to completely acknowledge the praiseworthy attributes of the Sultan. The conquest of Constantinople had glorified Sultan's dynamic personality in the Muslim world, but on the other hand had become a reason for hatred among the Christian historians. Even though the historians of every era recognized Sultan's qualities, they never erred in making allegations against him. Some would call him cruel, while others alleged that he did not honor agreements. Instead of giving our own opinion in this matter, we would refer to the hadith of the Prophet, in which he particularly praised the army and its leader that conquered Constantinople. After receiving praise from the blessed tongue of the Prophet, why would Sultan need any historian to reaffirm his greatness?